200 bikers standing in complete silence outside a small country church wasn't something the town of Redwood Falls, Missouri had ever seen before, especially not for the funeral of a man most of them had never met. But it all began the day a trembling 91-year-old widow named Margaret Doyle quietly approached a leather-clad biker at a roadside diner and whispered a simple request that would ripple across highways, biker clubs, and small towns hundreds of miles away. "I just need someone at the funeral." The story of how that moment unfolded started the previous afternoon when Margaret pushed open the creaky door of Riley's Roadhouse Diner, a place she and her husband had visited every Sunday for nearly 50 years before arthritis and age made the drive difficult. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. Leaning on a thin wooden cane that had belonged to her husband, Walter Doyle, who had passed away just 6 days earlier in the small living room of the house they'd shared since 1968. Margaret had dressed carefully that morning in a pale blue coat and a hat Walter once said made her look like the prettiest girl in Missouri, though the compliment had been spoken decades earlier when they were younger and the world felt larger and kinder. The diner smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and warm pie crust, and a few truckers sat scattered in booths, their low conversations mixing with the hum of an old refrigerator behind the counter. But Margaret noticed something else immediately, for large motorcycles parked outside the window, their chrome shining like mirrors in the afternoon sun. Inside at the corner booth sat 4 men wearing black leather vests covered in patches, their boots muddy from the road and their jackets draped across the seats. They belonged to the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club, a group known across several states for their loyalty to each other and their habit of riding long highways most people preferred to avoid. The largest of the men, Calvin Grizz Ramirez, had a beard stray with gray and shoulders that looked like they could block out the sun when he stood up. Yet there was something calm about him as he quietly stirred sugar into his coffee, while listening to the younger riders talk about road repairs, long rides, and the next state line they planned to cross before nightfall. Margaret didn't plan to approach them when she first walked in. In truth, she had spent the morning telling herself she wouldn't bother anyone with her problem, but the problem refused to disappear. Walter's funeral was scheduled for the following morning at St. Andrew's Church, a small brick building on the edge of Redwood Falls where the couple had attended services for decades, and the pastor had gently explained that very few people had confirmed they would attend. Their only son had died years earlier in an accident. Walter's brothers had passed away long ago, and most of their friends were either gone or too frail to travel. The idea of Walter being buried with an empty church had kept Margaret awake for 3 nights straight, staring at the ceiling and remembering the way he used to whistle while fixing old radios in the garage. She sat at a booth for several minutes pretending to read the menu while stealing glances toward the bikers, gathering courage that seemed to vanish every time she tried to stand up. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes, she rose slowly, gripping her cane, and walked across the diner floor toward their table. The younger riders noticed her first and fell silent as she approached, unsure if she needed help or simply wanted to pass by. But Grizz looked up and immediately offered a respectful nod. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said in a calm voice that surprised her with its gentleness. Margaret cleared her throat, suddenly aware that everyone in the diner had turned slightly in their seats to watch. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said quietly, her voice trembling more than she expected. "I know you're probably traveling through, but I wondered if I could ask something." The man exchanged curious glances, and Grizz gestured to the empty chair beside their booth. "You're not bothering anyone. Please sit if you'd like." Margaret remained standing, afraid that if she sat down she might lose the courage to speak. So instead, she clutched the cane tighter and continued. "My husband passed away last week. We were married 68 years. The biker unc's expression softened instantly. One of them lowered his gaze respectfully, while another removed his cap. "I'm sorry for your loss," Grizz said quietly. Margaret nodded and continued, the words coming slowly but steadily now. "His funeral is tomorrow morning. The church scheduled it for 10 o'clock, but there's almost no one left to come. She paused, embarrassed by how small and helpless the problem sounded when spoken aloud. Most of our friends are gone, and the few who are still around can't travel anymore. She forced a weak smile. I suppose I'm just afraid Walter will be buried with an empty room. For a moment, the entire diner felt unusually quiet. The hum of the refrigerator and the clink of dishes from the kitchen suddenly louder than before. Grizz leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "And what is it you're asking, ma'am?" Margaret looked down at the floor, gathering the last bit of courage she had. "I just need someone there. Just someone so he's not alone." The words hung in the air like something fragile. Bree didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her face, the deep lines carved by Tim, in grief, and the way her hands trembled despite her effort to stay composed. Then he slowly stood up from the booth, towering merely a foot taller than her, yet somehow managing to appear gentle rather than intimidating. "What time did you say the service was?" he asked. 10 in the morning, Margaret replied softly. Grace nodded once, the kind of nod that carried weight behind it. "Ma'am," he said, "I think we can make sure your husband isn't alone." Margaret thanked him politely, assuming he meant the 4 bikers might attend, which already felt like more kindness than she had expected when she walked into the diner that afternoon. What she didn't realize, what nobody in Redwood Falls realized yet, was that the simple promise made in that quiet diner booth was about to travel through hundreds of phone calls, messages, and midnight highway rides. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, the tiny church on the edge of town would be surrounded by something no one had ever witnessed before. What Margaret Doyle didn't realize as she slowly left Riley's Roadhouse Diner that afternoon was that the quiet promise made by Calvin Grizz Ramirez would travel farther and faster than she could possibly imagine. Because long after the old woman's taxi disappeared down the street and the sun began sinking behind the hills surrounding Redwood Falls, Bree remained seated in that same diner booth. Bree roaned, staring at his phone with a thoughtful expression that the younger riders had come to recognize as the moment when something important was about to happen. The Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club wasn't just a group of men who enjoyed long rides and open highways. It was a brotherhood built on an unspoken rule that respect and loyalty mattered more than anything else. And the story Grizz had just heard about a man being buried with no one, there had stirred something deep in him that reminded him of his own father's funeral many years earlier, when only a handful of people had stood beside the grave. The younger biker sitting across from him, a restless rider named Tyler Sparks Benton, finally broke the silence and asked, "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Riz slowly nodded, then unlocked his phone and opened a private messaging group used by dozens of Iron Brotherhood chapters spread across several states. Men and women who had ridden together through storms, breakdowns, and thousands of miles of asphalt stretching from Texas to the Midwest. The message he typed was short and simple, but every rider who saw it understood immediately what it meant. 91-year-old widow in Redwood Falls. Husband's funeral tomorrow morning at St. Andrew's Church. She thinks no one will show up. I say we change that. Within seconds, the phone buzzed with replies from riders who were still awake in roadside motel, truck stops, garages, and living rooms across the region. Send the address. How many do we need? I'm 2 hours away. Rolling out now. Some of them had never met Margaret or Walter Doyle, and probably never would, but the idea of an elderly woman standing alone beside her husband's casket felt wrong to people who believed that no one, especially someone who had lived a long life, should leave the world without witnesses. By 9 o'clock that night, riders from 3 different states had already begun adjusting their travel plans, fueling their bikes, or texting other members who might still be within riding distance of Redwood Falls. Meanwhile, in her quiet little house on Willow Street, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, carefully folding the black dress she planned to wear to the funeral. Gracie Lastreet planned to wear to the funeral, still believing that perhaps 4 bikers from the diner might appear the next morning if they remembered her request. She had no way of knowing that her small conversation had already sparked something much larger, because across highways stretching hundreds of miles in every direction, the low thunder of motorcycle engines was beginning to echo through the night as riders packed small bags, checked their headlights, and set out under dark skies, guided only by GPS directions and the simple idea that someone needed them there. By midnight, the Iron Brotherhood message thread had grown into a stream of notifications, so constant that Grizz finally muted the phone for a few minutes, just to finish his coffee at the motel, where he and the others had stopped for the night. Though he couldn't hide the slight smile forming beneath his beard as he watched the number of riders confirming their arrival climb past 20, then 30, then 50. "You realize," Spark said with a grin, "this might turn into something pretty big." Grizz shrugged slightly, though there was a spark of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "Good," he replied. "Big is exactly what that old lady deserves." And so the night continued, with headlights cutting across long, empty highways and riders leaning forward against the wind as their motorcycles roared through dark farmland and sleepy towns. Some traveling an hour, others 3 or 4, all heading toward the same small church that most of them had never heard of until that evening. The first few bikes arrived in Redwood Falls shortly after sunrise, their engines rumbling softly as they rolled through quiet streets where residents were just beginning to open coffee shops and hardware stores for the day. And by 8 in the morning, several more had joined them, lining up neatly along the road outside St. Andrew's Church, in a growing formation that caused passing drivers to slow down and stare in confusion. Local residents whispered to each other on sidewalks, wondering why so many bikers were gathering outside a church on a weekday morning, and the church caretakers stepped outside to investigate, only to be greeted politely by a group of leather-vested riders who simply said they were there for a funeral. What no one realized yet, not the curious townspeople, not the caretaker, and certainly not Margaret Doyle, was that this quiet arrival was only the beginning, because the distant rumble of more motorcycles could already be heard rolling in from the highway, and the number of riders heading toward Redwood Falls was still growing with every passing mile. By the time Margaret Doyle's taxi slowly turned onto the narrow road leading to St. Andrew's Church the next morning, the quiet town of Redwood Falls was already witnessing something it had never seen before, because the soft countryside silence had been replaced by the distant, steady rumble of motorcycle engines echoing through the streets as more and more riders rolled in from the highway, their chrome reflecting the pale morning sun, while rows of bikes lined both sides of the road leading up to the small brick church. At first, Margaret didn't notice anything unusual as the taxi moved slowly through town, because she was staring down at the folded funeral program in her hands, nervously reading Walter's name printed at the top, as if she needed to remind herself the moment was real. But when the driver finally slowed near the church in trance, he suddenly leaned forward over the steering wheel and squinted through the windshield in confusion. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what's going on here," he said carefully. Margaret looked up, expecting perhaps a small crowd of curious townspeople, but instead she froze as her eyes widened in disbelief. The street in front of the church was filled with motorcycles, dozens of them, parked in long lines stretching far beyond the church gate and continuing down the road like a river of black leather and polished steel. Riders stood beside their bikes, in quiet groups, their leather vests moving slightly in the morning breeze. And for a moment, Margaret wondered if some kind of rally had been scheduled nearby, because the sight was so unexpected it barely made sense. But then the taxi rolled closer, and she noticed something else. Every rider standing outside the church was facing the same direction, the church entrance, and many of them were holding their helmets respectfully at their sides. Just as the taxi stopped at the curb, a tall, broad-shouldered biker stepped away from the crowd and approached the vehicle, his beard catching the sunlight as he removed his helmet. Margaret recognized him instantly. "Mr. Grizz," she said softly, as the driver opened her door. The biker smiled warmly and nodded. "Good morning, Mrs. Sedbos." Doyle. Margaret stepped out slowly with her cane, her eyes scanning the endless rows of motorcycles again as the realization slowly began to settle in. What is all this? She asked in a trembling voice. Grizz glanced over his shoulder toward the hundreds of riders gathered around the churchyard before answering gently. You said you didn't want your husband to be alone today. As if responding to those words, the riders began quietly moving into position, forming two long lines that stretched from the church gate all the way to the entrance doors, creating a silent path of honor. One by one, helmets were removed, and the rumble of engines faded as the last arriving motorcycles shut off their motors. The entire street became still. Some residents of Redwood Falls had gathered along sidewalks and porches by then, whispering to each other in amazement as they watched the scene unfold, because the sight of hundreds of bikers standing silently with bowed heads outside a small country church was something none of them had expected to witness. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand as tears filled her eyes. Though these people, they came for Walter, she asked softly. Briz nodded. They came for you both. He gently offered his arm and Margaret accepted it as they slowly walked along the path formed by the riders. As she passed between them, each biker lowered their head respectfully, some placing their hands over their hearts, others giving quiet nods, as if honoring a man they had known all their lives. Inside the church, every pew was already filled with riders sitting quietly in their vests and boots, their presence transforming what Margaret had feared would be an empty room into a place overflowing with silent respect. Even the pastor paused in amazement when he stepped to the front of the church and saw the crowd gathered before him, clearing his throat before beginning the service with a voice that carried both gratitude and disbelief. Throughout the ceremony, the bikers remained completely silent, listening to the stories Margaret shared about Walter's life, the way he used to repair radios for neighbors, the way he whistled old country songs while mowing the lawn, and the way he never forgot their anniversary, even after 68 years of marriage. When the time came for the final farewell, the line of riders waiting to approach the casket stretched out through the church doors and into the street, each biker stepping forward one by one to pay their respects. Some saluted quietly, others rested a gloved hand on the wooden casket for a moment before moving on, their expressions solemn and thoughtful. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles returned slowly as riders prepared to leave. But before the first bike pulled away, Briz handed Margaret a small envelope. Inside was a card signed by dozens of riders who had attended, their names filling every inch of the paper. At the bottom, someone had written a simple message in bold ink. No one leaves this world alone. Margaret clutched the card tightly against her chest as tears streamed down her face. Looking out over the sea of motorcycles, beginning to roll down the road one by one. The thunder of engines slowly faded into the distance, but the feeling left behind in that quiet churchyard stayed with her long after the last rider disappeared beyond the hills. Because what began as a whispered request to a single biker in a diner had become something far greater. A moment of compassion that turned a lonely funeral into a farewell witnessed by hundreds, proving that sometimes the loudest kindness in the world arrives on two wheels.